I hope you sang it with sincerity of heart. Sometimes that's difficult, honestly. Satan's at work every opportunity he can, even in the middle of worship. If he can detour your mind, he'll do so. We're talking about worship this morning, just to continue the thought that Craig began last week. It's an amazing thing because we, many of us, most of us, have been going to worship all of our life. A few of you haven't been baptized later in life, might have been going somewhere else in another form of religion, and now we find ourselves compiled together and we're talking about what we've been doing for most of our life. Surely by now we'd have this figured out. And yet if you take a moment and talk to anyone, no matter what age they are, no matter how long they've been a Christian, they'll honestly tell you, I have to really struggle to make this right, to do it in a way that I think would really please God. And that's what we're after. And the prayer that we had just a moment ago, talking about taking from the lesson so we could be better servants, we take from the worship, which if we're doing it the right way, will by all means make us better servants. So there's a great application there and a great opportunity here. And so as we talk about worship this morning, I want to look at things maybe in a little different angle than what you've looked at before. Nothing unscriptural. I'm just hoping to help you to see something that I'm just forgetting sometimes and want to remind myself about. We live in a country that is highly focused on entertainment, as Craig mentioned last week, in so many different facets. And that concept of entertainment spills over into our worship, or at least it can, not saying that it should. And we too often talk about what we can get out of it, as if to say, I'm looking for some kind of stimulus. Now, worship, if you're doing it sincerely, should stimulate you, should provoke you to want more of God's presence, more of a service. But you don't work for a stimulus, you work for pleasing God. I want to read something that I took time to write and process through as we begin. Children, as early as age 1, are handed electronic toys to keep them entertained. As they grow older, they crave a greater stimulus, more excitement. Now, for those of you that are parenting right now, that's not to put you down, because your parents did the same thing. They just used different toys. They maybe not had the small handheld. They had the ones that plugged into the TV or the DVDs, or way back when there were VCRs, or before that, then just the television itself. So this has been something that's been going on for, say, 70 years or more. This idea of the stimulus that is kind of firing up the mind. And out of all of that, we continue to grow wanting more and more stimulus. And thus we have what we have today, a society that it's ready to fire on these electrodes of stimulus, but rather dulled down and bored at a common setting such as this, that doesn't have all the zip and the fireworks, etc. So in schools and churches and even in some businesses, when people are dissatisfied, they become bored. And they can sometimes look elsewhere, they'll do so, even in jobs, to find where their cravings can be met. This becomes a great problem for us in our worship. Anyone that is involved in leading worship is constantly aware that they're being observed. A long time ago, I was trying to figure out exactly what can I do to make my lessons better. And I started observing television. Not that I can draw from that, understanding how to do things, except in the overall impact that it makes. Because I was aware that if you sit down in front of a television set at any given time, most of you nowadays will sit down with a remote control in your hands. Do you not? You turn the TV on and you look at it and you're saying in your mind, entertain me. And you got about 5 seconds, and if you don't like it, another channel, right? And maybe you'll settle in on a channel for a few minutes, but you still got the remote in hand. And 5 minutes goes by and you are reevaluating. I think I'll move on. Another channel. And I was starting to think about this as far as my sermons go, because you can't go to another channel. You're stuck here. And then my mind said, oh, yes, they can. Because any one of you can take a mental detour at any moment. Because I know I do. I sit down and I think, I wonder if the fellowship meal's ready. Are they down there getting their things done? Now, I'm trying not to do that, but that's what's happening this morning. And so all of you, with all your different sets of things that's going on, sits down, and with your little mental electronic remote, you're flipping channels. Because we're looking for something different, and right now it's pretty relaxed. So where do we go? And this is what we have in worship. And yet, we can't stand up here and shoot fireworks off to stimulate you, to get you to look up here. It wouldn't be right. And yet I make every effort to make my lessons or my prayers, and any one of us up here, something that really richly rewards you, that stimulates you in a right way, and yet the whole time knowing that that's just barely igniting that spark that's usually bigger by watching all these other things going on. And that's a difficult thing. But now, having said that, think about this for just a moment. Because in this whole process, as we come in, and this is the only point of the lesson, we're missing the obvious. The big what's happening. Romans chapter 1, verse 20. I want you to look at it. Paul's talking about something 2,000 years ago. How could that apply today? Very much so. He talks in verse 18, as you're turning there, I'll give you a little background of the context, about the wrath of God that's coming. Verse 19, because what may be known about God is manifest to them, for God's shown it to them. And then in verse 20, if you're there now, he says, for since the creation of the world, the way back when, since the creation of the world, His, that is God's, invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made. So if you got out in the morning and you didn't go blindfolded, you saw sunlight and trees, possibly a river as you're crossing it, heading this direction, and birds flying through there, and the mountains in the distance, and you saw all of these things. God was saying, I'm here. But we probably didn't look at that because we were in a hurry to get to church. Everyone having an assignment, possibly running late. And that's just who we are. But what I want you to see is the obvious that we're not paying attention to. With all that's happening around, God is here. He's here. And He's making Himself known. Here's the point. The invisible, incredible, obvious is happening. At this very moment, right here in this assembly, we have an audience with God. Now imagine if you were getting ready to go meet the Queen of England. And I think that's even a tougher thing than going and seeing the President of the United States, truthfully, with the pomp and everything that goes into it, and all the things you read about. Don't ever extend your hand to the Queen unless she reaches to you first. and how you're supposed to go in and how you're supposed to act immediately. Men kind of bowing halfway, ladies curtsying, calling her by a certain way, and just all of these things just to get an audience with the queen. It's something incredible. And we have, every time we gather together, an audience with God Almighty, who's made this entire creation. Now hold that thought, what Romans is telling us. Because what's happened here in verse 20 is, it was clearly seen, verse 20, the eternal power and the Godhead was there. Verse 21, but although they knew God, they didn't glorify Him, nor were they thankful. They forgot about Him. Now, we're not going to go to that extent of going off into idolatry, but we're racing down the road, headed to an assembly where God's presence is here, and we sit down and we lose our train of thought. And we don't even contemplate that God's right here. We're missing the obvious, the invisible, but the incredible obvious. Look back to Psalm 8 for just a moment here. The psalmist is writing something, I think, that kind of brings it together here. And then we're going to look at a book, an Old Testament book in Leviticus here. But verse 1 of Psalm 8. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent, some translations, majestic, they put, is your name in all the earth, who have set your glory above the heavens. Again, this focus on creation. Verse 3, when I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you ordained, what is man that you're mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you'd even visit him? You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor. Skip down to verse 9 again as he wraps up the song. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is your name. The psalmist is taking in God's presence. I don't know if he's sitting up on a mountain somewhere, but he's looking at all that's happening here and pondering all of this, and every place he's been, and all he can do is just break into praise, thinking about the fact that God's there. We have an audience, and he's sitting right here, an audience with God. Leviticus, chapter 8 and 9, God is setting up the Old Testament idea of worship. And as he's going through this process, he explains in previous chapters about the way sacrifices, etc., are to be done. Very unusual. Not anything, I'm glad to say, that we do today. Although we do have a sacrifice once and for all, and that was Christ himself. But in chapters 8 and 9, Aaron, Moses' brother, through his lineage, including his sons now in these chapters, are being consecrated as priests to be ones that would be offering these sacrifices. And God is very particular on how all of this goes about. And so you're reading all these things in chapter 8, for instance, verse 4. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. Just God saying, I want you to see how it's starting out. I gave Moses instructions, and he did it just the way I said. So he goes about in verse 5 and says, this is what the Lord commanded to be done. And so he goes on describing the tunic, verse 7, and things like that. And then verse 9, it wraps up at the very end and says, they did it as the Lord had commanded. You move on down, and he gives another set of instructions. In verse 13, Moses comes about and does all these things, and it says, again, as the Lord commanded. Now, it's amazing how he's going through here, and you'll see this over and over again, the continual emphasis here of saying, as the Lord commanded. More instruction, as the Lord commanded. Now, in this whole process in chapter 8 And in chapter 9, same thing. Verse 36, for instance, in chapter 8, a culmination, and said, "And so Aaron and his sons did all the things that the Lord had commanded by the hand of Moses." And then you go through chapter 9, he does all of these same things again. And you're thinking, boy, this is incredible. Really detailed expressions of how God is wanting his worship to take place. As he does so, I wonder if in the minds of these priests are thinking, why do we have to do this? Why are we going about all this way? I mean, incredible, the clothing and the wear and how things are put and all this, but God says so. Now notice that when it says, as the Lord commanded, that's for you. Because they knew they were doing it as the Lord commanded. But Moses writes in there, they did it that way, so you'll know that they did it that way, because they already knew. So that part of the emphasis, maybe not the details as much as they're going through and doing what God commanded all the way through the process. That doesn't really matter to God. So we're looking at the end of chapter 9 here. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle meeting and came out, and he blessed the people. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat on the altar. And when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces in worship to God. Fire from heaven, after going through the whole process and doing it the right way. And God saying, you have my audience. I'm here with you. You have worshiped, and I'm present. So incredible. Now that's the tedious activities of the Old Testament. And oh, by the way, there was a deviation in chapter 10. Aaron and his sons, again, still involved in the priesthood and doing these things. Nadab and Abihu, older sons of Aaron. Verse 1 of chapter 10, the sons of Aaron, they took each censer and they put fire in it, and they put incense in it and offered a profane. I think some newer translations accurately translated unauthorized. An unauthorized fire before the Lord, which He'd not commanded them. He didn't say do it this way. He just said, this is the way I want it. So there wasn't a command to do it any other way or any authorization for it. But they added that. In verse 2, so fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, not the sacrifice now, but the sons of Aaron. And they died before the Lord. And again, you might say, they have the Lord's attention. They had an audience with the Lord. Worship wasn't right. And it's real obvious from the way things ended. We have an audience with God. And we march in, and we're partaking the Lord's Supper, and we ought to be doing it the right way. And you say, is God really? I mean, this is New Testament. Is He watching? Now, He's not going to strike us down, because obviously not everybody does it right. Not all over the world. It's obvious that people do things differently, and we're reading sometimes of things that in the world's religions that are practiced that you know aren't in the New Testament. And you don't read about them being struck down, so maybe it's not the same. We'll get into that, but all I want to do this morning is think about this whole concept of having an audience with God. As you march in here and you talk to your friends, and I was taking all that in, and I was standing here, and Craig was leading the song, and I was thinking about the song, and I was also looking at the people, and I was thinking, how is God viewing all this? Because He's here. And as I was getting up to say the welcome, and people were standing up and visiting, I thought, He's got to be happy about this, that you're here, that you've come here to make a difference in your life and to honor God. But I'm not sure if we've grasped the whole idea of how close we are to God at this very moment. Mark chapter 12 for a moment. I think maybe just a couple weeks ago I talked about this from a different angle, but it might have been in Nicaragua, actually. I was down there a few weeks ago. Mark chapter 12, let's start at about verse 24. 41 is what I want to say. Now Mark writes this: Jesus sat opposite the treasury. Not the big building that has U.S. Treasury on, okay? This is inside the temple where the giving is going on. So he sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, the offering plate. And many who were rich put in much. But one poor widow came in. By the way, this is real important for you to capture. Poor widow. No money. Widow meaning no way of getting any more. Nobody out there working. I get what's given to me from the corners of the field, gleaning according to the Old Testament, what might be left for me, or what someone might hand me. And if I have children, maybe a little bit there. So one poor widow came in and threw in 2 mites, which make 2 quadrants. A parallel translation says it's all she had. Verse 43, so he called his disciples to himself. Hey guys, come over here. They weren't paying attention. They weren't watching what was going on. So Jesus gets their attention. And he says, surely I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who had given into the treasury, for they all put in out of their abundance, but she put in out of their poverty. She put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. Now here's what I want you to see out of this. God's watching. Jesus sat there. That wasn't a coincidental thing. I'm just visualizing. He's on the side. Things going on over here. Guys, come here. Look at this. God is watching what goes on in our service. It wasn't the first time that Jesus observed giving. It may have been the first time that he focused on it for their attention. But since the creation of the world, God has been watching our worship, our sacrifices, our giving, our singing, listening to our prayers. We have an audience. He's sitting here watching. And so when the Lord's Supper's passed, he's watching. Not in the sense of, are you doing it right? But more, does this mean something to you? Because it should. Is this still about me when you take the Lord's Supper now? Because it very much should be. And when we sing, Lord, take control, is that what you were thinking? Or were you thinking, oh, I've sung that song 100 times. I'm tired of that one. I'd like a different song. Or I don't like those new songs, or I don't like those old songs. I mean, what's in our mind as we worship? God's taking it all in. And he very rightfully deserves every bit of it to be about him and for him. Worship belongs to God. He's the owner of it. And so when I'm taking the Lord's Supper, or I'm singing songs, occasionally I'm encouraging one another, but it's still about him. To motivate others to, hey, look, there's God. And what an incredible, obvious thing that's going on. And we rush in we say hello, we enjoy our presence, and those are good things, and that's part of our reason for assembly, but we miss the most incredible obvious. God is here. And those that don't make it on Sunday morning, what an opportunity they're missing. It's not like, oh, you missed worship again. We're checking that on your list. It's like, we can sit in the assembly and miss worship if we don't think about, God, what's going on here, and do it for the right reason. There was a fellow in Oak Ridge, and I know I've talked about this person before because it just so sticks in my mind. One of just the members went along just every day doing what we all do, Sunday mornings, there all the time. See him on the way out the door, hey, good to see you. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, never seen it before in my life, this huge lump just comes up overnight on his neck. It was sticking out the size of a golf ball. It's just overnight. Where did it come from? Oak Ridge surgeons wouldn't touch it. You go to MD Anderson. We don't even want to start on that. There's something not good about this. He comes back. Basically, he said, I've got about a month to live. And guys, if you're about 45 years old with a teenage daughter and a wife that doesn't know a whole lot about taking care of homes and cars, what would you do? You'd buy a new car. You'd make sure she had the best long-enduring vehicle there was, because in a month from now, you wouldn't be around to fix it. He went through and he double-checked the insulation in his house, good engineer, had special things done to it and all that, fixed everything, soundproof, alarm-proof, everything set up. He's leaving. But something else happened. Every sermon, however meager they may have been preached, on the way out the door, fist clenched, and he looked at me and goes, powerful. His mind changed. Everything that was happening in the assembly now was powerful and enriching, because his whole thinking now had changed. And he could, can you say feel? Not feel like emotional feel, but he understood finally that God's presence was there. And God was speaking to him, and those prayers were going up to him. And boy, were his prayers not sincere. There was an old gentleman when I was a college student, just become a Christian at Freed-Hardeman. Little country congregation, and we would go out to this little place, and we held services for the farming community. It's about 8-10 people. Buell Archer was one of the farmers. Short fellow, wore overalls everywhere he went. He had Sunday overalls and he had everyday overalls. Pickup truck, dog used to ride in the back. Most faithful dog you ever seen. He was at church services. Even when the pickup truck didn't make it, he'd make it to the back door and he'd sit. Buell had heart problems and had a mild heart attack. And one of the things in talking to him was the doctor said, you got to quit singing in church. He says, too much strain on your heart. Back then I led singing sometimes, Craig. And we were singing one night, and I was leading singing, and got to the song, There's a Mansion Now Empty Just Waiting for Me. He couldn't hold back. Had to sing. I think it was next week we had to carry him out to the hospital. He didn't care. There was something worth singing about in what God was giving him. God's presence. Most incredible thing. It happens every time we gather. Genesis 22, and the sermon's yours. Now the context is we're looking at a study of a character you've heard about before. His name's Abraham. And by the time you come to chapter 22, Abraham has been given this son that he'd been waiting all of his life for. His name was Isaac. And in chapter 22, verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass that after these things that God tested Abraham." And you probably read this story. God says, "I want you to go offer your son Isaac as a sacrifice to me." And Abraham doesn't question. He's been worshiping all of his life, and he goes and he does it. I'm sure in his heart he was wondering why. I'm sure he didn't want to. But out of all of that, when he got up on that mountain, he had an audience with God, just the same. And as he was headed up that mountain, and even after the event, his comment was, "God provides. He's here, He takes care of me, He's watching over me." When we gather into God's assembly, and He's sitting here, and He's watching you, and He's wondering what you're giving, He's wanting to know, do you think He provides or not? Is He taking care of you? Is He not a God that's worth worshiping? You bet He is. May your worship be improved by just pondering these thoughts. And as we've said in the prayer earlier, and may it make you a better servant. But how incredible it is that God's here today. Just thinking about this whole week long has drove me crazy. And I kept praying, God, I hope I do this right. I hope I've done it right. I hope we do our worship right. And we'll talk more about worship and what it means and what it involves. But take it from the perspective, we've got God's audience. It's incredible. Praise Him. Trust Him. Follow Him. And as we close the lesson, if your heart's not right with God, get it right. If you're not a Christian, come and be baptized. We serve an incredible God that's keeping up with you all along the way. How are you serving Him? Do you need to change? Then come while we stand and sing.